Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. What that means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'm generally speaking the guy that you can come to with just about any question regarding Tolkien or his works, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, The History of Middle-earth, Unfinished Tales, any of it, really. And if I don't have an answer, snappy, I will get back to you after some research. If you want to submit a question, you can do so right in the comments. I get to as many comments as I can, and I try to answer all those questions, and some of those questions are really, really good. If you want to be featured in a video, you'll have to go through Quora. There's a link to my Quora account in the description. It is extremely easy to set up a Quora account yourself. You could use your Facebook account or your Google account. I think you might also be able to use Twitter. I'm not sure. But anyway, yeah, you could go there. And even if you don't go through my link, if you ask any question on Quora related to J.R.R. Tolkien or his works, after you ask the question, it is going to give you a list of people that you could potentially tag to ask them the question, to request that they answer it. They call it an A2A, ask to answer, over there. And my name will be at or near the top of the list, so you can find me that way as well. Of course, every week I just pick a few of the questions that I've answered and feature them in videos if they're interesting enough to talk about and whatnot, or if I have something to say about it. And we have, I believe, 14 questions this week. And we have a reading for you, of course. Now, you notice I do not have a book in my hand. That is because I did get a request through a comment there to read maybe a little bit of the Book of Lost Tales. And the thing is, I don't have on me a physical copy of it. So whenever I need the history of Middle-earth, which I don't have physical copies with me right now, I use digital copies. So I figured, if somebody asks for it, I'll read a little bit of the Book of Lost Tales. In this case, I'm going to do the Book of Lost Tales Part 2, specifically regarding the Fall of Gondolin. This is the only completed narrative of the Fall of Gondolin. It is an earlier draft than the bits that are seen in the Silmarillion, and the very detailed final draft was never finished. That's in Unfinished Tales as well, and a lot of it you can get in the book. The Fall of Gondolin sort of puts all of the different tales of the Fall of Gondolin together, but I'm going to read you the first bit of the Fall of Gondolin as seen in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2, Tuor and the Exiles of Gondolin. Just give you a little bit of this. Which bringeth in the great tale of Eärendel. Then said Little Heart, son of Bronweg, know then that Tuor was a man who dwelt in very ancient days, in that land of the north called Dor Lumen, or the land of shadows. And of the Eldar the Noldoli know it best. Now the folk whence Tuor came wandered the forests and fells, and knew not and sang not of the sea, but Tuor dwelt not with them, and lived alone about that lake called Mithrim, now hunting in its woods, now making music besides its shores on his rugged harp of wood and the sinews of bears. Now many hearing of the power of his rough songs came forth near and far to hearken to his harping, but Tuor left his singing and departed to lonely places. Here he learnt many strange things, and got knowledge of the wandering Noldoli, who taught him much of their speech and lore. But he was not fated to dwell forever in those woods. Thereafter 'tis said that magic and destiny led him on a day to a cavernous opening down which a hidden river flowed from Mithrim, and Tuor entered that cavern, seeking to learn its secret, but the waters of Mithrim drove him forward into the heart of the rock, and he might not win back into the light. And this, 'tis said, was the will of Ulmo, Lord of Waters, at whose prompting the Noldoli had made that hidden way. Then came the Noldoli to Tuor, and guided him along dark passages amid the mountains, until he came out into the light once more, and saw that the river flowed swiftly in a ravine of great depth, with sides unscalable. Now Tuor desired no more to return, but went ever forward, and the river led him always toward the west. The sun rose behind his back, and set before his face, and where the water foamed, many boulders, or fell over falls, were at times rainbows woven across the ravine, but at evening its smooth sides would glow in the setting sun, and for these reasons Tuor called it Golden Cleft of the Gully of the Rainbow Roof, which in the speech of the gnomes, Glorfalco Chris Ibranothoth, Now Tur journeyed here for 3 days, drinking the waters of the secret river and feeding on its fish. And these were of gold and blue and silver of many wondrous shapes. At length the ravine widened, and ever as it opened its sides became lower and more rough, and the bed of that river more impeded the boulders against which the waters foamed and spouted. Long times would Tur sit and gaze at the splashing water and listen to its voice. And then he would rise and leap onward from stone to stone, singing as he went, or as the stars came out in the narrow strip of heaven above the gully, he would raise echoes to answer the fierce twanging of his harp. One day, after a great journey of weary going, Tur at deep evening heard a cry, and he might not decide of which creature it came. Now, he said, it is a fey creature. Now, nay, 'tis but some small beast that waileth among the rocks. Or again it seemed to him that an unknown bird piped with a voice anew to his ears, and strangely sad. And because he had not heard the voice of any bird in all his wandering down golden cleft, he was glad of the sound, although it mournful. On the next day, at an hour of the morning, he heard the same cry above his head, and looking up he beheld 3 great white birds, beating back up the gully on strong wings, and uttering cries like to the ones he heard amid the dusk. Now these were the gulls, the birds of Osse. In this part of the riverway there were islets of rock amid the currents, and fallen rocks fringed with white sand at the gully side, so that it was ill going, and seeking a while, Tur found a spot where he might with labour scale the cliffs at last. Then came a fresh wind against his face, and he said, This is very good, and like the drinking of wine. But he knew not he was near the confines of the great sea. And as he went along above the waters, that ravine again drew together, and the walls towered up, so that he fared on a high cliff top, and there came a narrow neck, and this was full of noise. So I'm going to stop there because I could read you passages from the various versions of the Fall of Gondolin all day, really. This was one of the earliest versions. Notice that it mentions Earendel, not Earendil. They're actually the same character, but we see some of the earliest versions of it. Tolkien here mentions Noldoli, which we could understand to be Noldor. But he also mentions gnomes, which are interesting because gnomes also sort of became the Noldor later on. I think in this sense, he's using gnomes not as specifically speaking about Noldor, because in this phase in the writing, the Noldor are called the Noldoli. I think he's using gnome here as a generic term for what we would call elves. And, there is the story that as he's reading this to his friends, the Inklings, and they're giving him critiques and feedback and such, one of the biggest things was that they could not get it out of their heads that a gnome was a sort of a short, squat creature with a beard, sort of like an even smaller version of a dwarf. As a matter of fact, in there's a heavy metal band from Germany called Blind Guardian, and they've done very many songs about the Lord of the Rings. They did an entire album based on the Silmarillion, but they had a song once called Lord of the Rings, and part of it is sort of singing out the ring verse. And there was 2 versions of the song. There was the original version that they recorded, and then there was a later version that was re-recorded. And the later version that was re-recorded, Hansi Kirsch, who's the singer of Blind Guardian, sings 7 rings for the dwarves. But in the original recording, he said gnomes. And I think it's because, he was German and he might have read The Lord of the Rings in German originally, and his translation to English, because almost all of their songs are in English. They have a few that are in different languages, but almost all of Blind Guardian's songs are in English. He may have thought that whatever word it was in German may have translated in English to gnome, and then later found out that it was actually dwarf. So, the Inklings were not alone. Many people, they think of gnomes, they think of something akin to a dwarf, like the garden gnome that you would see. But Tolkien was insistent that his gnomes were tall and fair and clean, I shouldn't say clean-shaven because they couldn't grow beards. And so later he called them elves, which is interesting because in a lot of Germanic folklore, elves are not fair. They're not. They're nasty little creatures, or they're sort of, they could be like evil fairies or such. So, but that's stuck though. His version of elf stuck, and generally when you think of an elf, you do tend to think of either Dungeons and Dragons or perhaps Tolkien. So another interesting thing to point out. Actually, I have to bring the text up. I made my point about the gnomes and the Noldor. Oh, Ose. The birds of Ose. So in this, Ose is in charge of the birds. We would say that Manwë became the one that, of the Valar at least, that was most associated with birds, whereas Ose is not a Valar at all. He's a Maya. But he is associated with storms in the sea, and he's sort of a... I don't want to say that he works exclusively for Ulmo. He did join Melkor at one point and then came back into Ulmo's service. But in the version of this that I read last week, which is from Unfinished Tales, in that version, it was interesting because Ulmo said to Tuor that there is going to be a storm, and it is because because Ose doesn't agree with me. He agrees with the rest of the Valar, and he's heeding their ban and enforcing it, whereas I am not. But you see a lot of the same story beats, that he travels, he follows birds, he finds caverns, he scales cliffs, he plays his harp and such. So a lot of the same story beats here in this early version are seen in the final version. Of course, this is a complete version. It doesn't just follow Tuor to Gondolin, but tells the story of the actual fall of Gondolin, and it can get pretty wild in there too. But anyway, that's our reading for the week. Like I said, we have 14 questions to get through, and just to give a quick channel update, we're at, as of this recording right now, we're at 1,759 subscribers, so we're sort of, barreling towards 2K here, which is pretty amazing, and everything's going well with the metrics and everything, so I want to thank you for that. And if you haven't subscribed, well, I'm not going to ask you to subscribe now. I'm going to ask you to subscribe at the end of the video. I'll still have the little graphic that shows, because I think it's cute, but the reason is I want to make sure that you guys like the content. You shouldn't just subscribe to a channel just because somebody asks you to. So what I'm going to say is stick around, and if you make it to the end or even most of the way through and you enjoy the content, then I'll ask you to subscribe. But anyway, let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in from Stefan Ritter, who asks, at the Council of Elrond, Gloin mentions how Sauron offered the 3 remaining dwarf rings to Dain II Ironfoot if Dain would ally with Mordor. If Dain had accepted, had Sauron given Dain the 3 dwarf rings, what power did the One Ring have over them? Well, it's a big if, because I would say that Sauron absolutely would not give any of the rings he had to dwarves. And I'm going to get into why, but I'll also say that the condition for him, saying that he would give the 3 remaining dwarf rings to Dain was not ally with Mordor. They didn't actually ask for that. They simply asked for the location of Bilbo Baggins. Where is Bilbo from? And they were pretty open, whoever the emissary was, whether it was the Witch King or Camel or the Mouth of Sauron or some other sort of emissary. Personally, I think that it was probably some other emissary that was probably neither one of the Nazgul nor the Mouth of Sauron himself. And we talked about this recently on the Council of Tolkien. But anyway, the reason that I bring this up is because it's simply tell us where he is, and it even mentions that Bilbo has something that belongs to Sauron, and that it is specifically a ring. But they said it's no big deal, though. It's the least of rings, sort of suggesting that it's a lesser ring, which we don't really hear very much at all about the lesser rings in Tolkien's work. Just Gandalf mentions that there were lesser rings, that there were essays in the craft of creating rings of power, and that they were not very powerful. And this sort of alludes to them as well. But here's the thing, it's all lies, and you see that they didn't say that this is an important ring and that Sauron really, really needs it. They just said that it is a little ring that, that Sauron just happens to like. He fancies it. And right there you could see there is a lie, and it's not hard to say that the whole thing's a lie, because Sauron in general and his people that would pass along his messages for him, he's a liar. And I would say that the king under the mountain, Dain II Ironfoot, knew this, that he was being lied to, which is why he stonewalled them. He didn't give an answer. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just sort of said, I need time to think. And they were like, okay, but don't take too long. And they would come back and he would say, I still need time to think. And meanwhile, he's sending Gloin and his son Gimli to Rivendell, where Bilbo is, to warn him and also to seek counsel from Elrond. The fact is that Sauron had given rings of power to the dwarves in the past, and at this point he actually had the One Ring, which is the ruling ring, the controlling ring, the one ring to rule them all, and it didn't work out exactly the way that he needed it to. He couldn't control the dwarves even when he had the One Ring. The rings did have an effect on the dwarves, but that effect was to make them worse, not to fall under Sauron's control. The rings were made for elves. And by extension, they work pretty well on men as well, because we're essentially the same species as elves. There's no physiological difference between men and elves. There's a spiritual difference between us. But dwarves are too different. Sauron, at this point, he has 12 rings, and 3 of them are out of his reach, and then there were another 4 that were destroyed. So there is those 12, and then there's the 3 that, that he believes the elves have. Of course, Gandalf actually has one of them. So he's not going to waste any more of the rings that he has, considering he's down to just 12, on dwarves. And he certainly wouldn't want to give them away before he had, the One Ring in his hand. He would want men to have them, because men were his success. So absolutely, I would say that Sauron was lying, and that Dain knew it, and Dain probably had no interest in the rings. Thorin had an interest in recovering Thror's ring. And Gandalf, told him at one point that or actually, I don't think he told Thorin. He told Frodo later on that there would be no ring in, because he did tell him, because Sauron took it, and it was believed that he didn't tell Frodo. He told the White Council that. I'm a little mixed up here. I'm sorry. But he told the White Council that. He did not tell Thorin that, but he did tell later on, when he mentioned how it was believed that Balin was looking for Thror's ring when he went to reclaim Moria, and Gandalf mentioned that he would find no ring in Moria because Sauron had the ring. Thror had passed it on to Thrain, and then Thrain had it forcibly taken from him by Sauron before he died. And that's a whole other thing, to do with the Hobbit and whatnot. But what I'm basically getting at here is, Sauron's a liar. He's not going to give rings to the dwarves, because they're at this point aware of what these rings can do and what they're all about, and the ruin that had come to Moria previously. And I think Dain is very different from Thorin. He's a more reasonable person. I think he's wiser in many ways. And so in this instance, I would say, he told them not to go to Moria, and they went anyway. I think that he would want nothing to do with any of these rings, especially knowing that they're coming from Sauron. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Here's a question that comes in from Yusuf Khan, who asks, who is the Dark Wizard in Amazon's The Lord of the Rings series? Do we see him later in the Third Age? So it's interesting because, the second season is finished, and we don't get the identity of the Dark Wizard, or the character that at least is referred to by several other characters as the Dark Wizard. So there was an interview that came out a little bit after the final episode of Season 1, where the writers said that the Dark Wizard is not Saruman, because that was a very popular theory. When we first got the pictures of Ciarán Hinds as a quote-unquote Dark Wizard, everybody was saying, Saruman? And myself, like many other people, were saying, well, yeah, but it's the Second Age, and it just seems strange if Saruman was dark that early, because who would trust him later on? It just seems very strange. And the writers agree with this. So they said he's not Saruman. So that leaves, there's 3 possibilities. So the final episode gave us a lot of information. So just sort of a bullet points list. The stranger is Gandalf. That is 100% confirmed at this point. It was, of course, theorized from the very first time that he appeared, but we know for sure they have used the word Gandalf. That's it. We know he's Gandalf. The Dark Wizard said that he was told by Manwë that the stranger would come to find him and that he was waiting for him. Next one, the Dark Wizard thinks that Gandalf is his friend, and he is sort of surprised that Gandalf does not join him, but tells him that he'll be waiting. This is similar to, but not exactly like, the conversation in the Third Age where Saruman sort of asks Gandalf to join him, and sort of like, you're my friend, you'll join me and everything. And then is sort of surprised that Gandalf didn't join him. But in this case, he says, I'll be waiting, and he goes away. He doesn't try to, like, capture Gandalf or anything like that. The Dark Wizard is not Saruman. We know this. The show's writers said that, that would make no sense for the story they're telling. There are 5 wizards in the show. Remember I said that the show, I've said this many times, is not in continuity with anything else. It's not in continuity with the Silmarillion. It's not in continuity with the movies. It's not even really in continuity with the Lord of the Rings. It's sort of its own thing. It's certainly inspired by the Lord of the Rings. It's based off of the Lord of the Rings, like the movies in a sense. Not as grand as the movie is, of course, but the movies contradict the books. The show contradicts the books. So they could have gone with there being more than 5 wizards, but in this case, the Dark Wizard specifically mentions that there are 5 of them, and he also does not like being called the Dark Wizard. He says he's not the Dark Wizard. That's just something that men came up with that sort of misunderstood him. Now, I would say that, out of the 3 possibilities, since we know he's not Gandalf and we know he's not Saruman, that leaves Morennitar, Ramastano, and Radagast, and I would say that it is Morennitar the Blue, also known as Alatar. So he's seeking a companion. He's looking for the other blue wizard, Ramastano the Blue, Palando. As he isn't Sauron and he's not Gandalf, I would say that also just based on, the personality and everything, it's extremely unlikely that he's Radagast. That would be kind of really crazy if he was Radagast. So he's one of the blue wizards. And I would say that he's Alatar, Morennitar the Blue, instead of Palando, Ramastano the Blue. Because I would say that Alatar was, as far as the blue wizards, he was sort of the leader. And in the original, story in the Silmarillion, of course, they're not basing it directly off the Silmarillion, but they did use some things from the Silmarillion in season 2, which was interesting. So I'd heard rumors that they were going to, and that they had special permission to use very specific things. Out of the wizards, the ones that were chosen first, the volunteers, I should say, the ones that volunteered to be wizards were Curanir, or Curumo, that's Saruman, and Alatar, or Ramastano. I'm sorry, Morennitar. And then Alatar asked for Palando, Ramastano, to be his companion. And then, so now we have 3 of them. And then Manwë says, well, I want you to take Oloran with you, that's Gandalf. And then Yavanna comes in and says, I want you to take Iwendil or Ravendil with you, that's Radagast. So, it just sort of makes sense that he's waiting for his friend to show up. And I would say that he is confused and he thinks this guy is the other blue wizard that he's waiting for. And of course it's not. He's the gray. He's Gandalf. Is he really dark? It seems like they could go either way with this. He's very steeped in the Easterling culture. He did kill the Easterlings that threatened the Hobbits. But then again, he didn't I think that was just a show. I think he was just trying to make everybody believe that he's a nice guy, because earlier the Easterlings were saying we will kill the halflings, and he didn't really bat an eye at that. It just didn't go the way that he wanted it to go. But I would say he's one of the blue wizards for sure, and I would say I would pick Morennitar the Blue as the one that he likely is. Okay, next question. Here's a question that comes in from Miguel, who asks, did Sauron see himself as a good guy until the end, Or did he realize that he was evil but didn't care anymore? I like this question. This is a good question. I think after the Fall of Númenor is when he knew for certain that he was evil. Sauron was at perhaps his most evil in Númenor. Nothing that he did there could be seen as bringing order or keeping chaos at bay, even from his own twisted perception. His goal was genocide, plain and simple. He took an already fallen people and twisted them even further into the depths of depravity. They worshipped Melkor. They worshipped Sauron as Melkor incarnate. Not that Sauron isn't incarnate, but I'm just saying that they believed that he was Melkor in a way. They burned men in the temple as tributes to this satanic force. And in the end, even with some trepidation, the last king, Ar-Pharazôn, attacked the Undying Lands. As the great wave overtook Númenor, Sauron sat on his throne in the temple and laughed as he fell into the abyss. His actions afterwards show how far Sauron was from, I think I'm the good guy somehow. He was angered that despite all this effort that he went to in Númenor, in a sense, still existed. The people did, at least. The faithful that had come over with Elendil in places like Gondor and Arnor. He would not be happy until they were completely gone. And I think this single-minded track was part of his eventual downfall. Tolkien noted that Sauron, the word Sauron, was an insulting name for him that the elves cooked up. Some also called him Gurthar, which was another insult, but this fell out of favor after the fall of Beleriand. Sauron thought of himself as Tar Mairon. His original name was Mairon, which means admirable. Sauron means detestable. Tar Mairon is admirable king. That's what he thought of himself as. It's a common misconception that he called himself that in Númenor. He absolutely did not. He would not use the name Mairon because it's Quenya, and they did not allow the speaking of Quenya under Pharazôn's rule, and he would not use Tar because that was the Quenya title as well. He would use Ar. They called him Zigur in Númenor, which means sorcerer. But anyway, but he thought of himself as Tar Mairon. And but Tolkien specifically said that he stopped thinking of himself and referring to himself as Tar Mairon after the fall of Númenor. And I think that Sauron realized at this point that he had sort of turned a corner in evil, and he thought himself irredeemable. Even in this, he was wrong. He had opportunities for redemption even after this, and he turned them down one by one. Nothing is evil in the beginning, and no one, save Melkor, is beyond redemption. But if someone believes that they're beyond redemption, that they cannot be redeemed, they're essentially embracing evil. They're leaning into it. I believe that abandoning the name Tar Mairon as a moniker for himself was his thought process boiling down to, there's no going back. I can never be forgiven. I'm as bad as Morgoth was. I might as well lean into it. And he was wrong. He could have been redeemed, but of course he didn't. He didn't have that wisdom. Okay, next question. Here's one that comes in from Catby, who asks, who would you consider more dangerous, not necessarily more powerful, Morgoth or Sauron? Morgoth is more dangerous because without Morgoth, there wouldn't be a Sauron. Melkor, who was later called Morgoth by the elves, and that was also an insulting name. It means dark tyrant. He created the entire concept of evil, and thus the entire concept of danger. Without him, there would be no evil. Sauron would just be Mairon, a student of Vala with great skill in magic and crafts. Sauron, of course, he was very dangerous, but only because he had been so corrupted by Melkor. Nothing is evil in the beginning. I said that in the last answer, and I'll say it here. Those are the very wise words from Elrond, who was speaking specifically about Sauron. He was once good. The danger of Melkor is that even after he's gone from the world, so much of his power is still left in the world, embedded deep in the earth, and the hearts of mortals, he's still the cause of everything evil that happens. So I would definitely say he's the dangerous one in that sense. Okay, next question. Here's a question from Aron Björstrom, who asks, if you were to adapt the Fall of Númenor and the changing of the world to live action, would you show the Valar consulting Ilúvatar, or would you preserve the mystery of these beings and convey this event to the viewer in some other way? If so, how? I find this to be a very fun question. The issue with depicting Ilúvatar in a Fall of Númenor adaptation is that the audience would have to understand who Ilúvatar is. And the same thing goes for the Valar, really. The issue with adapting any specific story from the Silmarillion is that you're taking it a little bit out of context, which is fine for the most part. But we need to give people who are unfamiliar with the lore context. Ilúvatar is he that is always present yet never named in The Lord of the Rings. His movements are subtle and unnoticed by most, including most readers. In the Silmarillion, we are given the creation myth, the Aina Lindala, and the Valaquenta gives us the hierarchy and the structure of Tolkien's cosmic beings. Taken out of context, the Valar, or more accurately, just Manwë, calling on Ilúvatar may just seem to come out of left field, a deus ex vala, if you would, or even if you won't. I do think, though, that it would be important to make audiences understand that it was not the Valar themselves who reshaped the world and destroyed Númenor. I always thought that any future Tolkien adaptations would benefit greatly from opening up, if they had the rights to do this, with an extremely abridged Ainulindala and Valaquenta, just sort of an overview. In the beginning, there was Ilúvatar. He created the angels. They sang the universe into existence, explain who Melkor is, explain who the Valar is, and then get to the story so that when all these elements come back into the story, we understand as audiences, not me or you, but people who maybe haven't read the Silmarillion and are just like, oh, this is like the Lord of the Rings, it's from Tolkien, that they could understand what's going on. Okay, next question. This question comes in from Shawnee, I think it is, who asks, did any ringbearer from Isildur onwards make a concerted effort, say over years, to master the One Ring, if not to Gandalf, Saruman, etc., have any evidence that it could ever be mastered by someone other than Sauron? So no, Isildur was actually the only ringbearer to even make any sort of effort to master the ring. Let's look at who held the ring or touched the ring after Isildur. Déagol had the ring for all of a few minutes, and then he was murdered. Sméagol had it for hundreds of years. He never tried to use it for anything other than invisibility and just to adore it. He was obsessed with it, but he also hated it. He never understood that it could be used for anything other than vanishing. Bilbo had a similar relationship with the ring to Sméagol, though he only held it for 60 years. He used it to hide from things that were either dangerous or annoying to him, like his cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, and he never thought that it contained any power other than just disappearing. Frodo was actually just trying to destroy the ring, not use it. Galadriel sort of instructed him on how it's used and what Frodo would have to do to master it. He would have to become far more powerful, and he would have to train his mind in the domination of others. Gandalf, he only held the ring for like a split second. Frodo handed it to him, and he chucked it right into the fireplace, and that was it. And even when he retrieved it with tongs, so he didn't touch it after that. Tom Bombadil, he played with the ring like it was a toy, and then he handed it back to Frodo. He had no interest in it. And then there was Samwise. He was only trying to carry on Frodo's quest once he thought Frodo had died. He had no desire to use it. As a matter of fact, when the ring gave him visions to sort of try to prevent him from giving it back to Frodo, it gave him a vision of himself as a great hero on a horse who could turn all of Middle-earth into a garden. That was the vision of power that it could give to Sam, and he rejected it. So he had no interest in mastering the ring. None of them, up until Frodo, chronologically, would even knew what the ring actually was. They thought it was just this magic ring that made them invisible. And of course, I'm not counting Isildur in this. And Deagle didn't even get to find that out. He never even got to put the ring on. The only ones that could potentially master it, out of the ones that I mentioned, were Gandalf and Bombadil, neither of which had any interest. There were several beings, I would say, that could master the ring, but they were either wise enough not to try, or it was Saruman, who thankfully never even laid eyes on the ring. So I would believe, yes, somebody who was great in power could, as Galadriel said, master the ring, but they had to be evil, because they had to master it, they had to, as Galadriel said, train their mind in the domination of others, and to wish to dominate others is in itself evil. So you would have to become evil to master the ring, which is why Isildur couldn't do it. He was too good for the ring. Okay, next question. Here's one from Kamali Kokavali, who asks, I hope I'm saying it right, who was, in your opinion, the bravest character in the Tolkien Legendarium? Easy. Sam. Samwise Gamgee. Samwise frickin' Gamgee. Sam is the bravest because he's the one with humble roots. He's the one that he just does it because he feels he has to. It doesn't matter how afraid he gets. A lot of people think that bravery is a lack of fear. No, bravery is overcoming fear. Bravery is when you're very afraid, but you do the thing anyway. And it doesn't matter why you're doing the thing. It's just that you do it despite fear. Sam comes from extremely humble roots, but he's the absolute last person to back down from danger, out of the Hobbits, that is. Sam had many opportunities to turn back. The most prominent one was at Lothlorien, where he was tempted to rush back to the Shire to prevent the images that were shown to him in the Mirror of Galadriel from coming to pass. But he stuck with Frodo anyway. Though he stated if anyone messed with the Shire, they were going to catch it hot, which just shows you he's ready to throw down. He doesn't have the backgrounds of the others. Frodo is like Bilbo. Pippin comes from a family that's known for being adventurous, and Merry is pretty unflappable. Merry, I would say, is the most similar to Sam in temperament, but nothing was ever really expected of Sam in his life other than that, maybe by Gandalf. He wasn't rich, he wasn't important, he had no legacy, all these things came later. As a matter of fact, in the very beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, it's mentioned that it's unusual that he's even literate. So the fact that he's literate, his father, Hamfast Gamgee, known also as the Gaffer, says that Bilbo taught him how to read, taught him his letters, is the way he put it, and he's like, I hope no trouble come of it, from Sam having book learning, So he's just, like I said, nothing's ever expected of him, and he just goes above and beyond. And we had an interesting discussion in the comments section of the question about Sam's motivations. The motivations don't matter. What matters is that he goes headfirst into danger, despite everything else. When he thought Frodo was dead, he thought, I'll just have to do it myself. And somebody called it fatalistic. And whether it's fatalistic or not, like I said, it doesn't matter. What matters is that he's overcoming great fear. Okay, next question. This question comes in by the request of Michael Lokiki, who asks, are there female orcs in Middle-earth? Of course, yes, absolutely. Orcs, after all, don't just spring up out of holes in the ground, despite what the films show. It amused me, the movies amused me, that Gimli makes a joke about how some people don't believe that there are dwarf women and that dwarves must spring out of holes in the ground. And then they show orcs essentially being pulled out of sort of muddy egg sacs in the earth. Now, of course, this was Saruman breeding the Uruk-hai, but in the books, this didn't happen all at once, and he had already been breeding them for a few generations before the events of the story would even start. According to Tolkien, orcs breed, and this is his exact words, in the matter of the children of Ilúvatar, which is to say, in the same way that elves and men breed. There are, of course, orc women, though no one in the story comments on what the physical differences are, if there are any, that are, apparent to the naked eye when they're all clothed and everything. And it's likely that all the orcs that we quote-unquote saw in the books are probably male, because they're pretty much all soldiers. So there's definitely orc women, of course. Okay, next question. Here's a question from Matthew Culbertson, who asks, do hobbits ever recolonize the Gladden Fields during the Fourth Age, where Smeagol and the Stoor hobbits lived originally? No, not as far as we know. By the end of the Third Age, most, if not all, of the hobbits lived in Eriador, and almost all of them were on a section of Eriador called Arthedain, located in Breeland, the Shire, Buckland, Westmarch. Aragorn, as the king, expanded the borders of the Shire, though some would still have lived in Bree. The hobbits at the Gladden Fields were gone, one way or the other. Saruman misdirected the Nazgul, looking for the location of hobbits, by sending them to the Vales of the Anduin. And in one version of the story, and this is in Unfinished Tales, they only found settlements that were long abandoned, but another, there were still some hobbits there, at which they killed. The only reason the hobbits lived there in the first place was that these were re-migrant Stoors. They didn't like the Shire. They didn't like Breeland. They didn't find it to be to their liking. So they were culturally different, and they regressed to an earlier point in their culture. It seems that the vast majority of hobbits prefer living in Eriador. These guys just didn't like it, and they went back to a place that they had been previously. The only hobbits that we ever hear of living elsewhere in the Fourth Age would be Merry and Pippin, because they went down to Rohan when they heard that Éomer was dying, and then they lived the rest of their lives in Gondor after that. Okay, next question. All right, here's a question from Digital Systematic, who asks, after Sauron was defeated and Isildur took his ring, how or why could he not follow Isildur as an invisible spirit, and once the opportunity arose at the Anduin, take the ring back for himself, such as he must have done after Númenor's fall? Because Isildur would probably be able to see Sauron following him the moment he put the ring on. Much as Frodo could see the Nazgul when he put on the ring, Isildur would notice Sauron following him around the very moment that he donned the ring. While it is true that Sauron's spirit form would have no issue actually picking up the ring physically, he did indeed carry it back with him from Númenor to Middle-earth as a spirit. Sauron was pretty weakened after back-to-back defeats, and Isildur, with the One Ring, may have caused real trouble for him. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf notes that Sauron had assumed that the ring was long destroyed, and had only recently learned of its survival. As Tolkien wrote that Sauron's spirit departed the moment Isildur cut his finger off, he wasn't privy to the conversation with Elrond, and he did not know that Isildur did not in fact destroy the ring, as Elrond advised, or that the elves did not destroy the ring. Before you say anything in the comments by like, well, how could Sauron not think the ring was destroyed? Keep in mind that what he did with the One Ring was something that had never been done before, and he did not really know the effect that it would have on him if the ring was destroyed. Okay, next question. So I just love this person's username. This question comes in from Witty Name Here, but it's spelled like the name Witty. What was it about the formation of the rings that meant the One Ring could influence even the 3 elven rings? Was it something in the techniques used, and would the lesser rings have been affected if they were in use and Sauron had regained the one? We spoke a little bit about the lesser rings earlier. Not enough is written about them. They were mentioned like once in The Lord of the Rings, and that's sort of like the be-all, end-all lore about them. You can't really make a judgment call there. As for the 3, it's very easy to explain. First of all, you refer to them as the 3 elven rings, which many people do because they're held by elves, or at least 2 of them are. They were traditionally held by elves. Gandalf has one of them. But they're all elven rings. They were all made by elves for elves. The craft of making rings of power was taught to the elves by Sauron, who disguised himself in fair form and called himself Anatar. Celebrimbor is included in the elves. So he learned from Sauron. He knows one method of making rings, and that's Sauron's method. So when the One Ring was forged, the spell that was put upon it was, well, it started with One Ring to rule them all. The key word here is all. It's not One Ring to rule the 16 rings that I'm aware of and not any of the others, you know. I would guess with the lesser rings that he probably could control people wearing the lesser rings. I don't think he would bother doing that because those rings are so weak. And they were really just like sort of toys for the elves to play with. But like I said, it's one ring to rule them all, not some of them. Okay, next question. Okay, so here's the one from the thumbnail, and it comes in from the Oski Boski, who asks, were the Balrogs more loyal to Melkor since they were his students from the start, unlike Sauron, who joined him later after Aula? Evil is never loyal. Evil in Tolkien's world is wholly non-cooperative. At no point is any evil being loyal to anything but itself. We see this in The Lord of the Rings with Saruman. He's no friend of Sauron's, nor is Sauron a friend of his. They don't see each other as equals or even as master and underling, but they're both trying to use the other one to fulfill their goals. Sauron and Morgoth, that was the same thing. Sauron sat out the War of Wrath, likely because he saw the writing on the wall, and he was denouncing Morgoth the moment that it was all over. When we get creatures that seem loyal, there is more to it than that. Orcs, for example, they hate their masters, but they hate men and elves more. They will go with whoever keeps them fed and gives them weapons and armor, but they're not loyal, they're just cowed. Balrogs are greater beings. But if we look at who they are and what they're all about, we can see that they're not that dissimilar to Sauron in one important way. They believe that Morgoth will help them fulfill their own goals. Balrogs use whips. They're not the most effective weapons for killing. They're made for grabbing things or lashing at things. They're instruments of pain. The Balrogs smote Fingon into dust and trod in his blood until there was nothing left. They mock. They enjoy inflicting pain. What I'm getting at here is that Balrogs are cruel, and Morgoth gives them the opportunity to indulge in their cruelty. That is the only real source of loyalty here. Morgoth got so many followers because he allowed them to indulge in their base desires. This doesn't make them loyal. It just means that they're using Morgoth as much as he's using them. Okay, next question. Here's a question that comes in from Kevin Perez, who asks, with the exception of The Lord of the Rings, every fantasy book I have ever read ends near the climax. Why do they not end it when it is clear they have returned to their new, ordinary world? That's a good question, and I can't offer much insight because I have not written fantasy novels like that. Tolkien wrote a war story, that is to say, that a story that greatly is concerned with a war. Part of this is coming home, and in some cases finding out that the war blighted your peaceful land. Tolkien famously complained that The Lord of the Rings was entirely too short. He would have liked a great deal more, but his publishers would have liked to actually publish the novel in a finished state within his lifetime. Tolkien denied that the Scouring of the Shire was based on his homecoming from World War I, because he said that the ruination of his country started before he left for the war. But he also understood that leaving the story off at Sauron's defeat or even at Aragorn's ascent to the throne doesn't make much sense if the story is told by Frodo and his friends. It's not just Middle-earth's story. It's not the story of Sauron. It's not the story of Aragorn. It's the story of Frodo and Sam and Pippin and Merry and even Bilbo. It doesn't do to have the story end with Sauron or with Aragorn, but in choosing to send Frodo off into the Undying Lands and Sam getting his happy ending with domestic bliss, we get fantastic closure for the primary characters. I can't answer why other authors don't do this because I didn't write their books. You'd have to ask them. You'd have to track them down and say, well, why did you end it here? And they would probably have an excellent reason, because everybody tells their story in their own way. Nobody is going to write exactly like Tolkien, just like nobody is going to write exactly like Stephen King, for example, who usually just stops. You know, he doesn't write an ending. He just sort of stops. So there's that too. Okay, and now we get on to our last question. And our final question comes in from Andrew Benyai, who asks, I should say, where do hobbits come from in Tolkien's Legendarium? Are they children of Iru, or is their origin story like that of the dwarves? So I could go on for hours about the possible origins of hobbits, and I have. And if you want to read a really, really long article that I wrote about the origin of hobbits, just go to my Quora, and you'll see go to where my answers are, and I have one that's pinned. It's the origin of hobbits. But the question is interesting here, because it's sort of asking the same question, but sort of from a slightly different angle. The question of how and when hobbits came to be, that's an open question. I've given my thoughts at length in the past, and like I said, it's a very long thing. It would take me probably over an hour to explain it in a video. But it's surmise. It's reasonably educated surmise. It's coming from like a lot, and I do mean a lot of research. But what we do know is based on the foundation that the hobbits are essentially an offshoot of mortal men. Cousins of ours, in Tolkien's words, derived from men, said in the text. So if elves and men are Ilúvatar's children, and the dwarves are his adopted children, then I would say that hobbits are his grandchildren. They are not men, but they are of men. They are derived of men. They're an offshoot. So there you have it. So, yeah, I was actually feeling pretty down before I started this video, and look at me, I'm all cheered up. So thank you guys for allowing me to do this every week and allowing me to talk way, way, way too much about J.R.R. Tolkien and all of his works, because this has been a passion of mine for a really, really long time, and I really love it. And if you've gotten to this point in the video and you also have a passion for Tolkien, go ahead and hit that subscribe button at this point. If you haven't already done it, now's the time to do it. And by the way, just a quick little postscript on that last question. I got a comment from Dave Owens, who said that my answer on the origins of hobbits is required reading for any true Tolkien fan, which I just love that comment, because it's so wonderful and probably more than I deserve. But just thank you for that absolutely ringing endorsement. Anyway, we will see you guys next week. We'll have more questions and more answers and such. And thank you to all of my subscribers and followers and everybody. And if you'd like to support me in a different way, you could consider membership on the channel. It's very cheap. It's $5 a month. And what do you get out of it? You get to see all the videos early. That's the main thing. You also get some emotes and such, which will probably become more useful once I start doing live streams here on YouTube, which is going to happen in the not too distant future. So keep an eye out for that. I already do live streams every day on Twitch, but it's usually gaming live streams. But Tolkien streams twice monthly, always on a Thursday night. Usually the first Thursday of every month we have the Council of Tolkien, and then one of the other Thursdays I do readings, transformative analytical readings, of course, which I then post here on YouTube later on. And if you can't be at streams, that's fine, because I always post them here on YouTube as well. See you guys next time.